So welcome to this webinar organised by the Institute of Business Ethics. We're here today to talk about the 5-generation workplace. And in particular, what does it mean for organisations that want to build and maintain a really strong, positive, ethical culture? Will 5 generations in the workplace make it easier to really have a positive speak up culture? Is it going to cause some extra challenges in the workplace? Is it going to be all of the above? To help us to unpick these issues today, I'm delighted to welcome Rebecca Robbins and Patrick Dunne, who are the authors of the 5 Generations book about 5 generations at work, discussing these questions. And we also are joined by Lucien von Schomburg, who is one of the members of the Institute of Business Ethics Future Business Leaders Network. I'm David Grayson. I have the pleasure and privilege of chairing for a few more weeks the Institute of Business Ethics Board, and I'm your moderator for today. As you can see, the message in the chat from Katie, who's our organizer of these webinars, along with her colleague Alex Johnson. We would appreciate if you can post your questions as the conversation goes on. I will, first of all, try and unpick a little bit what Rebecca and Patrick are getting at in their excellent book. And then we will start to explore a little bit, with the help of Lucien as well, some of the implications for building ethical cultures. And then I'd also very much like to draw in you and your questions as well, please. Just to put you on alert, we have got 1 or 2 polls during the course of the webinar to explore some of these issues as well. But first of all, Rebecca, could I turn to you and just explain what are these 5 generations in the workplace? You make it very clear in the book this is a rather Western construct, and I know from my own regular work visits now to Asia that they look at these issues in a somewhat different way, but at least in a Western context, these different generations. Can you explain and just unpick what these generations are?
I'll do it. Thank you so much, David, and thank you for opening such an energizing session. Really looking forward to it. I'll spend a very brief time on it, and for reasons that I think you know, because we, as Patrick and I, often talk about what is so powerful about the research that we did underpinning the book, that there's evidence across the 4 continents that we worked across that, really this is about looking through lenses rather than labels. So I think we need to be very careful about the labeling. We were just talking about that together coming onto the call around the generation that we have all grown up in and the generation that we perhaps identify with. So I think that's an interesting and rich one. It'll be interesting to get everyone's thoughts on that. I mean, very simply, and we say 5 generations because, of course, the big point is that as populations are aging and we are living longer, it is resulting in the most generationally diverse demographic in history. And I think the other thing that's sort of worth double clicking on before we go into those very generations is that ostensibly the narrative of these webinars tends to index on what that means for the people inside our organizations, but ostensibly hand in hand, it goes to follow that the same is true of our clients, our customers, our consumers, our partners, and our stakeholders. So when I work with CEOs and different leaders, and Patrick and I are working with a whole gamut of people on this, we often say this is not a project or initiative. This is something inherently hardwired to our business. So I thought I'd just start out with that big picture point, because I know, again, we very much align on this. But and I also say 5 generations with a bit of fix and flex, if you will, because ostensibly not every organization will have that literality of 5 generations. But that was what was important in the book, to really demonstrate this point that we are in this tipping point of expanded and amplified generational diversity. It's a simple, hard truth. And of course, that's very exciting because of the richness that it brings us. So in terms of generations, we obviously have Gen Z, which is still rising into the workforce. So career starters, early careers, and actually well entrenched in many organizations, into then millennials, into then Gen X, and then into baby boomers, and then into what are known as silents. Again, we have to be very careful. Again, I'm very cautious when we talk about labeling and labels, but for the purpose of just setting the scene, those are broadly the five generations. And it's interesting at the very top end of that spectrum, with the oldest, because again, people forget sometimes that those roles are multiple. They might be chairs of boards, they might be business owners. At the same time, and Patrick will wax veritably lyrical on this, as chair of the Royal Voluntary Society, we also mapped, again, when you look at social purpose and the wider ways in which we exert change for good in the world, when of course we need it most, the spectrum of volunteers in organizations alone is really fascinating when you look at the youngest to the oldest. But I'll pause there because hopefully that's painted a bit of a picture around what we're talking about.
Fantastic. And Patrick, you actually talk about in the book your experience as the chair of RVS, major volunteering organization, of course, in the UK. You talk about some, I forget exactly where in the West Midlands, but somewhere in the West Midlands you went and you found somebody who was one of the silent generation, i.e. somebody born before 1945, working alongside a very, very young person, so a Gen Z individual. And you were really excited by the fact that they were sparking off each other so positively and so on.
Yeah, absolutely. It was Stoke. It was in Hanley, which is a really challenged part of Stoke. And this is one of our volunteers. He works in the kitchen. He's a fantastic guy. He lights up everyone's day. I mean, for many of the people who come to the centre, this might be their only hot meal. And he trains some of the youngsters how to do stuff. He serves the staff. He literally waltzes around the place. He's a pretty cool dancer for his age, but he's just got that sort of spark and that personality, and he's such a kind person as well. And he just is a really wonderful human being, and I think he has a massive impact on all the generations sort of younger than him. And if we think where he's grown up, the conditions when he was young, because we define generations not just by age in the book. We're looking at what's the economic and social environment they grew up in, what's the technological environment, whether people have been born in conflict or not. And of course his generation were very young through the Second World War, or uh, just immediately following it, but they were deeply impacted by those things, as many young people will be across the world today in conflict zones. So, and it's interesting when you hear young people ask about those experiences, and and they start to understand why people think that's the way they do, and what they think, and vice versa, the other way around. He finds it endlessly fascinating. You hear, he's a wonderful listener, and he loves to listen to young people talking about what the things that matter to them. And he's like a relationship guru as well, but we probably better not stray into that territory. Yeah.
Very interesting and important point, which we will explore a little bit further later in this conversation, I'm sure, about how different generations, because you have different experiences, look at the world in some different ways. And having, as a manager, at very different levels of an organization, frontline supervisor up to C-suite and board, understanding that people do have those very different experiences and therefore do react in different ways is an important part about being an effective manager, I suspect. Now, I will put my cards on the table. I am right bang in the middle of the baby boomer generation. I was born in 1955. So very, very much in the middle. And we've got a quick poll just to see who we have on the call. So if Katie, it's possible to have our first poll up. So which generation do you most identify with? Are you one of those silent generation people born before 1945? Are you one of the the baby boomers like me, born between 1945 and 1964, or Gen X, born between 65 and 79 or 80, and then millennials up to born up to to 2000, or are you one of the Gen Z, or are you or Gen Z, depending on whether we're talking American or talking English, or would you prefer not to say? So if I can ask everyone just to tell us. All right, so hosts and panelists cannot vote. We're excluded from this, but we'll just give you a moment or two. I'm definitely not going to put our external guests, Rebecca and Patrick, on the spot by asking them to identify which generation they most identify with. But Lucian, whilst we're waiting for the votes to come in, can I put you on the spot? And who do you identify most with? Which generation?
So I guess I would be officially categorized as a millennial. But if you ask what generation I identify the most with, I think that's a trickier one to respond. Maybe baby boomer, actually.
Gosh.
I think I could resonate with you, David. So maybe that's why I'm saying that. But no, officially a millennial, which I'm also happily to embrace.
Okay, fine. So I don't know whether, Katie, it's possible. Right. Okay. So we do have. We've not got everyone voting, but we do have somebody from the silent generation. So excellent. We've got some baby boomers. Yep, and as one would expect, probably predominantly it's Gen X and the millennials. Fantastic. Thank you so much for taking part in this. Now, Patrick and Rebecca, why did you write this book? Why now? Why do you think it's particularly relevant today?
Rebecca, do you want to go first?
I will happily do that, Patrick. We tend to tag team on this, David, so we'll do a bit of ping pong if that works. So I think a couple of big points, if we'll start with. I think that one of the biggest points is where there has been attention, and there is still a little bit too much attention, which is on this incredibly divisive discourse around generations. With the labeling of every new generation has come the onslaught of marketing media. If we go back to, and I was using Aristotle just the other day as I was talking to somebody about this, back in the days of ancient Greece and Rome, the conversation about the rise of the new generation has been coming in ad infinitum. So it is nothing new. But what is different, as ever, as always, is context. And of course, over the past years, this generational narrative has spiraled into this hyped and overhyped narrative, almost pitting generations against each other. And a lot of that has been driven by marketing and media. So I think that's one point to bear in mind. It's something that Patrick and I were working towards, I guess, very much this shared agenda concomitantly as we started to see the rise of this. And so started to put the two things together. The second thing that I think underpinned it was that both of us, we were very united in our mindset in terms of we were already doing a lot of work around generational diversity without us even talking about it as such, because we saw it as a clear strength, be it from cross-generational work that we were doing in terms of organizational culture transformation on the one hand, to setting up next generation boards to help us better inform decision making in organizations. But I think we had certainly, from our evidence base, and this was sort of layered over a few years, in parallel then with research that we went on to undertake. And I'll just finish with that point and then hand over to Patrick. But I think, this point that we had already evidenced it in work that we had seen, that work that we were doing from what we'd heard from other people, that there was altogether more progressive things happening. And of course, the third point is, that was evidenced in the research. So we traveled across 4 continents. We pulsed a series of qual and quant and AI-driven research. We should say, by the way, as 2 very fiercely passionate writers, not a touch of AI hit our pens, literally or metaphorically, but AI was incredibly helpful in terms of getting to the heart of where were the real narratives and discourses going on, rather than this perception, misperception, and stereotyping that we would be led to believe. And frankly, also is quite dangerous, because that is what is showing up in CEOs and leadership's narratives on social media, and we need to be, again, very careful about reframing that. So as I hand over to Patrick, I think we're very, edified and energized over the past few months since the book has been out, that we've seen evidence of. One, the book has helped to reframe the narrative that we are, in the context of our times, in need of something more pragmatic and hopeful around doing better business, which this fundamentally is. And second of all, that the huge response to this maximising mindset that we show in the case studies is absolutely out there in bucket loads. So I think we're excited in ways in which we can connect the dots at a grander scale. But I'll hand over to you, Patrick, to continue.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it was all about this maximizing mindset that I was thinking, it's brilliant having all these different generations in the workforce. And there's so many ways in which they can spark innovation, can, reduce risk, there's so many different sort of aspects of value that you get from it, both in terms of commercial and also sort of feeling enriched by it, so sort of fulfilling value, not just pound note value. And I was thinking, and Rebecca was thinking, well, there's probably loads going on that we don't even know about. We just know about what we know about. Wouldn't it be wonderful to go and explore and find out what good things people are doing around this intergenerational thing? And that was a big spark. And then the process. I mean, we could have never stopped. We found so many fantastic examples, and there were lots in the book, but there were lots we just didn't have the space to include, and we kept stumbling across things where thinking, wow, that's a really interesting idea. So, the LVMH idea, what Mars is doing, what Hoffmann La Roche is doing, what the EU is doing, what the Welsh government's doing, so many different things from across the world in very different contexts, different types of organizations, different sizes of organizations, different points in those organizations' history. And that principle of making the most of what you've got, whether that be physical assets, whether that be the people, was just really there. And it was a hard job actually narrowing it down, wasn't it, Rebecca, to things we thought would be, really capture the many different aspects that we were coming across. I guess embedded within it was this thing that it seemed that the organizations that took the trouble to try and understand people, the different generations, just as they do in other aspects of diversity, that thought a lot about how they communicate to be effective at that, and thought about bringing out the most rather than just trying to put plasters on, irritants and things like that. They were transcending beyond that. They were sort of making those little things irrelevant because of these bigger gains that they were getting, and the motivational benefit of that too. So quite exciting, really, and actually it's been wonderful as well since it hit the streets to hear that it's resonating.
And what for me was very striking was that you didn't dwell on the stereotypes. You very quickly got into, so what are some of the exciting things which well-known and not so necessarily so well-known organizations are doing to capitalize on the advantages of having a multi-generation workplace. Maybe just to share with colleagues on the webinar today, one or two of the really interesting things that you found. I don't want to steer you too much, but one of the areas I really liked was effectively the encouraging of social entrepreneurism in the LVMH luxury goods company. But go wherever you'd like to, Rebecca. What were
David, that's a beautiful
exciting
segue.
things that you like?
You know me too well, don't you? You knew I was going to pick up on it. Thank you so much for that. And you raise a good point, just to go back to your previous point about not dwelling on the stereotypes, because I think what Patrick and I were very keen to do, and it was evidence in bucket loads in that research across those 4 continents, was this is about celebrating individual difference and how we connect it to collective potential. And it was true to Patrick's point about those companies who were they weren't even thinking about conflict resolution. It was problem solving hardwired into, how is our business going to be relevant in decades to come? And that's really, really exciting. So, and I'll just dwell on a second point before I go into the LVMH case study, which is, as you know, I'm a bit of a quote nerd. And we do have some beautiful quotes in the book, and there's one that we treasured from Toni Morrison in her Nobel Prize acceptance speech, where she talks about meaning that secures our human difference. And I think that's very much in the spirit of the book, which really gives you a sense of how we wrote and what we were writing about. But I'll share briefly the LVMH story. And I love this on so many levels. Patrick and I often talk about this, and I've worked with LVMH over many years. And I think one of the reasons it was very dear to my heart, because as we know, so LVMH is the powerhouse, one of the leading preeminent group in luxury across a whole portfolio of categories and different brands, owning everything from Dior to Vuitton, Sephora, and so on, as we know. What is telling, of course, about this organization is they're very vocal in many ways. They don't tend to share a lot about what is going on the inside of the organization. For LVMH to come on board with this book and actually say, we want to share our story, there was a sense of, that sort of openness and transparency and greater good. And not only did they share what they did, but they were very generous in opening up how they did it, hopefully to inspire others. And I think the other point is, I know we have a plurality of industries and sectors and categories represented on this call. The reason I like this case study specifically is, this is a highly articulated organization operating across 75 brands, 6 categories. So the vertical structure is actually very operative to the reason why the platform we're about to talk about came about. And that platform is called DARE. It's called LVMH DARE, which stands for Disrupt, Act, and Risk to be an Entrepreneur. And to your point, David, it was exactly that. It was a platform for investing in what I talk about as collaborative entrepreneurial, or rather intrapreneurial muscle. And I think the intra is operative because as Lucian and Patrick and I were talking coming onto this call, and Lucian's going to touch on innovation very shortly, which is innovation often has sat and tends to sit in a bit of a silo within organizations. It's a team of innovation, and that's absolutely fine. That still very much has space and vitality and vibrancy and purpose. But the insight here with LVMH DARE was it actually how it came about and why it came about. So there was one individual in the organization. She had hit sort of 4 years. She was working one of the brands, had a great role, but she needed her next challenge and ambition. And she thought to herself, where do I go? Do I go to another company where, in fact, I love this organization, but really, I don't really know enough about these other 74 brands in the portfolio. And as we know, so many organizations, highly articulated verticals, those individual brands or business units, don't necessarily have that cross-functional and horizontal muscle across the organization. So the LVMH case study is actually a brilliant example. And, Patrick is a brilliant mathematician as one of many facets of his backgrounds. And so we love to talk about the horizontals and diagonals in organizations, but it was such an important horizontal, one of the first most powerful and influential horizontals that connected everyone, that had the ability to open this platform up to everyone across the organization. And I think that's the important point, that when it was set up, it wasn't set up as a generational project or initiative. It was, we need to solve for this in our organization. We need to, one, solve for greater knowledge, fluency, and transparency across the organization. Second of all, we need the platform, the enabler, to enable us to do that. So this new horizontal, the platform LVMH DARE. 3, we need to make it open to everybody in our organization, because, of course, to Patrick's maximizing mindset point that we speak to in every one of those case studies, this is about channeling the wisdom, expertise, perspectives of everyone at the organization, regardless of role, brand, culture, level of experience. And just to wrap it up in terms of what's coming out of this, these are not theory-based challenges. These entrepreneurial challenges are hardwired to LVMH saying, we are in the fashion industry as one of our big verticals. We know, therefore, that we contribute to climate crisis. We want to be part of the solution. And so the challenges that are thrown up on this platform are all hardwired to real problems and opportunities that LVMH is solving for. So it's a wonderful circular economy case in the process.
The thing I love about it is that
Sorry.
someone puts out a problem and people from all generations across the world can help out with that thing. And they've created other business units as a consequence of this and solved some big problems that they had, because they've had multi-generational teams working across the world who've just been in, everyone's invited to help out. It's a very simple thing, and I think there's what 30,000 people involved in it at the moment.
Yeah, that's LVMH has just over 200,000 employees worldwide, and the level of engagement in terms of active engagement is over 30,000 throughout and this is open throughout the year, which is pretty wonderful.
As you say, it's multi-generational, but it does particularly talk to younger employees who we know from lots of research are really keen to be able to demonstrate their leadership and their innovative powers at an earlier stage in their career. They don't want to be waiting for years and years before they're able to find practical ways of contributing to the business success and so on. So this does really talk not just to the younger generation, but it has a particular appeal there. Patrick, you and I have talked on previous occasions about the youth boards in one form or another, that different organizations, whether that's EY or whether it's NatWest Bank or various other well-known organizations, have been setting up and experimenting with, again, to try and get the views of a wider range of employees at an earlier stage. So maybe just give us a little bit about some of the things
Yeah.
that you talk about in the book on youth boards.
Yeah, so in 2014, or actually it was the end of 2013, when EY, that's why I would help them set up the EY Foundation and became the founding chair. I felt very strongly that we didn't just want a youth voice. That's sort of kind of something that's sort of obvious, really, that you'd want to know before you set your programs up, before you communicated with young people, that the way in which you're communicating, the programs that you have were relevant, were really good. I really wanted young people involved in the strategy and in the decision making of the organization right from the very start. So from the very start, we had we've called it different things over the years, but we're now on our 5th cohort, so it's over 10 years old. These cohorts tend to be for 2 years, and for quite a while now they've been called the Youth Advisory Board, usually 12 young people. We usually have 2 of them on the board as well, so there's that direct connectivity to the board. And we have them on, we have a Youth Advisory Board member on each of our subcommittees, so that whether that be audit and risk, nominations and remuneration. In order to make that work, you have to put a bit of effort in. So you've got to train them, you've got to really understand where they can make the biggest impact. I can tell you for absolute certain, and that's where Rebecca and I met through. Rebecca became a trustee on the EY Foundation. That probably our top performer after Rebecca, of course, as chair of the nominations committee, on our nominations committee, was a 19-year-old. Fantastic bullshit radar, really good assessing people, fantastic communicator. She's now a litigation lawyer. It's just wonderful. But I don't think we'd have decided to do the programs in the exact formulation that we decided. I don't think our legitimacy with young people, because we had that youth advisory board and people understood that we were listened to. We invested the time, they all had buddies and all the rest of it. And we're on our 5th cohort. The model is being continually developed, refined, largely by the young people coming up with the ideas. It's a fabulous thing. And I think we came across about 200 or so, didn't we, Rebecca, next gen boards in all sorts of businesses around the world. And people I've got different formulations of those. There's a whole chapter in the book on it. They're doing them in different ways to suit their purposes. There are legendary ones like Gucci, Financial Times, and various other well-known organizations that have them, and loads of organizations you probably never heard of who get a load of value because they've got that kind of youth voice. Interestingly, the next gen board idea is also being developed in a different way, in that the next gen can mean either the next generation coming behind the current one, or it can mean thinking about the next generation of the organization. And so you can have multi-gen next gen boards, which sounds mathematically exponential in some way, but that's quite interesting too, I think. And so there's one next gen board I'm aware of, that actually it is multi-generational, and it's focused on the development of a port. So it's people from across this port, and their focus is on what should be the future of that port, and they're delivering loads of value through doing that. So
And when we think about the pace and the extent of change that is only going to get faster and faster, the importance of having as many really different, interesting perspectives on what these different changes are going to mean for organizations and for employees and for customers and so on, and potential new competitors is so important. Now, we could spend happily an hour on this great book, and it's been nominated, so you're shortlisted in the Business Book Awards for 2025, which is super and is totally unsurprising, because it really is a good book. But we are the Institute of Business Ethics, and so we need to get onto what does all this mean for organizations that want to create an ethical culture. Now, does this make it harder to build an organization where there is a positive spirit of speak up? We know from some of the research that the Institute of Business Ethics has done, not least our International Ethics at Work survey, the most recent of which we published last autumn, that in many parts of the world, it's a real challenge because lots of employees feel threatened or feel nervous about speaking up and so on. And of course, that's talking about what might be inappropriate behavior or concerns that somebody might have about things that they're seeing in the organization that they don't think is quite right, let alone feeling sufficiently energized and engaged to do the kind of DARE program that Rebecca was talking about earlier. So is it going to be easier or harder, or is it just going to be different for organizations to really build and maintain a strong ethical culture? Patrick, any thoughts on that?
I think it's challenging, but I don't think it's been any different in terms of it's been challenging for a long time on these things. If you grew up in the 60s and 70s, you kind of it was there then, particularly where I lived in Totnes in Liverpool. There was intergenerational conflict, there was racial conflict, there was just conflict. I think the aging population is the big difference. So if you look at those different population pyramids, and you look at for every continent other than Africa, you've got this really aging population. Now, traditionally, the decision makers have tended to be older than the bulk of the population. However, with the exception of Africa, that's going to be different. And so there's an interesting thing I discovered recently in America, where there was a very young tech company, and it saw a honeypot in in an aged population, and it developed some products, and no one bought these products, and they were sold in exactly, the messages were all the wrong messages to the people they were trying to sell them to. And it was an interesting parallel between many years ago, when people were talking about, if you're a big consumer business, how come you've got no women on your board? Because women are big buyers of consumer goods. I mean, men are buyers too, but there was that, a lot of men didn't understand the market properly. And I think that same thing is happening in this different dimension now around that. I think the values point is really at the heart of this. And I suppose if we look at the world at the moment, who would you say, in general, from what you read in the papers every day, was the group of people by age that seem to have what you might feel the more comfortable values to live with, the more sustainable values, the better values for the planet? Is it the younger or the older? And And it's quite interesting when you sometimes hear older people complain about younger people and their values. You say, well, actually, hold on a minute, you know, what's our generation? What's that generation doing? So I think it's quite complicated, and I think there's a great danger in the stereotyping sort of path with this. It's more nuanced than older generation are better or worse, and actually that being better or worse is probably isn't that helpful. It's probably just they've just got a different way of looking at things.
So let's just hold that thought for a moment, if we could, because we do have another poll. And Katie, this is the poll number 3. If we could bring that up, and this is actually about, do we think that different generations do have significantly different ethical values, or yes, of course, different people have different ethical values, but is it more experience? Is it more if you're somebody of faith, or is it more to do with your upbringing and so on, rather than your actual age that is the really more important factor? And so, if again I could ask everyone who's on the call, apart from our panelists, we can't answer this, I'm afraid. So, do you believe that ethical values differ significantly across generations? Yes, no, or not sure. And just whilst we're giving everyone a chance to come into that, can I remind you, if you've got questions to Rebecca and to Patrick about 5 generations at work, and in particular also what it means for doing business ethically, we would love to see those questions in the Q&A. But just whilst everyone is responding, hopefully, Lucian, if I could bring you in as part of our Future Generations network in the Institute of Business Ethics, which is open to younger people from organizations that are supporters of the Institute of Business Ethics, and it's making sure in our own work as the IBE that we are also reflecting the views of different generations. So trying to practice a little bit of what Rebecca and Patrick are preaching in their book. Do you think that the significant that what's the thing that most differentiates people's values is based on their age, or is it other things in your experience?
I suppose age could be one of the variables at play here, but I don't think it's necessarily the essential one. And I suppose I could come here and come in with sort of different reflections, because on the one hand, I work as an academic within a university, as an educator, dealing with students, dealing with a lot of different generations. But on the other hand, also doing a lot of research myself into the ethics of technology, and also how technology sort of mediates our relationship with the world and the ethical values at play. And in a previous life, working more in the sort of football industry. And all of these 3 different contexts, which I think is nice in the way Patrick and Rebecca depicted. It shows that this question that you pose can be addressed in perhaps different ways. So if I look at the football context, which is why I bring it up, I think maybe there age, at least at the surface level, seems like it plays a more significant role, not least with the emergence of technology, data. It's playing an increasing role in terms of how we coach, how we recruit talent, and we make decisions on and off the field. And on the one hand, I think you can sort of see a clear distinction where you have more perhaps the traditional coach who resides or relies more on their gut feeling, their intuition. And on the other hand, you have what they call a new wave of sort of laptop coaches, which tends to be younger generations, and they are more data driven and try to make decisions based on data. And there's a bit of a tension there. At the same time, this tension also leads to I would say innovation, and I think this resonates well with the point again that Patrick and Rebecca are making so articulate in their book, namely that generational diversity can also be really a source of innovation. And I think that's something that was really reflected in at least where I worked, which was a Belgian football club, Genk, where we established a task force of people from different generations, but also from different backgrounds across the organization, and really tried to put the heads together and think of how can we really develop a new training methodology, or at least rethink our training methodology in response to the challenges of today. So I think there are things like age, but also people coming from different disciplines and different backgrounds. So really, more than age, it's really a plurality, which I think Rebecca also put quite nicely. Right? So there's a plurality at play, which can really contribute to this innovation.
Thank you. I think what we're hearing again from you there is this idea that yes, age is one important dimension that we should be thinking about, whether it's in a workplace culture or whether it's in a voluntary organization or a university or any other setting, but it's not the only one. And we shouldn't let any one dimension become over dominant. But let's just see if we have the poll. So so interesting. So just a small majority of those saying yes or no, but very close as to whether it is a particularly significant dimension. I wonder if we could turn, Patrick, to the question of what might be some of the challenges that organizations, in your experience, are facing as you have a workforce that has a bigger age disparity.
Yeah, I
What
know
are some of the things that are coming up that, if they're not managed well, if you don't have managers conscious of these things, could really start to become toxic?
Yeah. Rebecca, you'd like to go first on this. I know you.
Oh, Patrick, no, go, please. But thank you. Go ahead, please.
So it's really interesting in the context of the Royal Voluntary Service. So we only have 600 people, but we have, obviously many thousands of volunteers. And traditionally, the organisation has been weighted more towards those in later life. But we have good demographic mix in the staff, but in the volunteers, it's heavy weighted. Through COVID, because we were manning a lot of the COVID vaccination stations, getting food to people who needed food delivered, and so on. The organisation changed quite significantly through that phase, and there was a lot more younger volunteers. And what's been really interesting is a lot of that is stuck. So there wasn't this thing that people did think might happen, was all those young people would go back to work and they wouldn't want to volunteer anymore. Actually, quite the reverse. A lot of them, they love doing that, and they do it. We're now actually in a very interesting point where we are launching a new platform for all corporates and all charities to try and reduce the friction in volunteering, because volunteering is quite a frictionful thing for corporates. So in a lot of corporates, they give people a couple of days a year or however long to do their volunteering. And what they discover is that a lot of people don't take up those volunteering times. It's estimated 150 to 200 million hours a year are not used in that way. And it's usually dumped on the HR team. Go find our staff some volunteering opportunities, and they don't have the time to do that, and they don't know where to go. So this platform will enable charities to put all their volunteering opportunities on, get the safeguarding checks, all that for free, and volunteers to find those things and do that. And what's been really interesting is when we've been doing the design work on this platform, is designing it in a way that's kind of generation neutral. A lot of things, a lot of platforms are designed for millennials and Gen Zs, not designed for a broader group of ages. So a trap that we could have fallen into was, you get a bunch of young designers and they'll design something, clearly biased, with a bias towards young. So you need to sort of influence that pool. And I think that's true of in the US when yes, just for Christmas when we did the US launch, the big issue in the US is the aging workforce, but also the lack of jobs for that aging workforce. So what's been happening in the US is that population aging, and also at the same time, as more millennials and Gen Zs have become into senior leadership positions, and ageism is a bigger challenge in the US than it is in the UK. And so a lot of people post 50, get made redundant, get moved out of organizations. Yet because of poor pension provision in the US and very high healthcare costs, many people need to work, not just in their in their 50s, but well into their 70s and even some 80s. And there's a lot of tension in the US at the moment, and there are various lobby groups being established on behalf of older people to lobby for their case. And in some cases, it's become a bit, boomer v millennial, not really the way that, Rebecca and I would have in mind that, what there's a load of talent here. Why don't we make the best use of it, find a way to use that? So I think the gaps can easily emerge unknowingly, just because you pick what you think are the right people to design something. So a lot of it goes wrong in the organizational design, in product design, in marketing, in all these things. And so I don't know, Rebecca, you've got anything to add to that, but those would be a couple of thoughts from me on that.
I think, yeah, and I completely agree, Patrick, and I love your point about, the bias. We've seen that in so many shapes and forms. I think, conscious of time, David, I'll just add one thing, and I'm going to step back from a bigger picture, which is, and I do a lot of work in organizational culture, transformation, and consistently the same thing is true, is that there is too much noise going on in organizations. So and that's important, because the ability for us to make the space, to your point about more intentionality around the whole ethics discussion, and crucially action, half the time it's not there. And so the engagement stats that we all see, there was another report that just came out just a couple of weeks ago, and they're really tanking. And we've seen that consistently decrease through COVID, before that. And one of the reasons is, and actually Megan Wrights, a leading academic, has spoken to this over the years, and she talks about pathological busyness. So, I think, again, to get to maximizing mindsets, we also need to be braver as leaders. And I also think there's just an untapped opportunity for managers across organizations, because when we think about those horizontals, and you touched on that earlier beautifully, David, because they're multi-generational, cross-generational, these are the catalyzers, connectors, the lenses. If we only both train them and better and invest in them and empower them. Again, Patrick and I have worked for many years with the fantastic organization, the Chartered Management Institute, which talks about, the challenge of the accidental manager. Say, what about more intentional managers? But again, we need to be braver in saying no to things before we start them, interrogating the why, and crucially, therefore, enabling and making that space.
Thank you. And Lucy, I can see you're eager to come in on this one.
Yes, if I may, just because it really reminds me of my lifelong intellectual crush, Hannah Arendt, a German Jewish philosopher from the previous century. And it really, to Rebecca's point, it really reminded me of her saying that, or warning for this threat of modernity, the threat being this threat of bureaucracy, where we can too easily withdraw into anonymity. And in doing so, we lose this innate capacity of action. So by virtue of your birth, you have this capacity to take initiative. And it is through taking initiative that you really reveal to others who you are as a unique and distinct individual. This is where you experience what you would call authentic freedom. And ultimately, this is where you do the unexpected. And this is precisely what is needed as an antidote to what Rebecca and Patrick also referred to as wicked problems in their book, right? So we're dealing with a lot of wicked problems complex challenges, and the antidote to that is action, is initiative, is this actualization of plurality. But at the same time, we too easily withdraw into this sort of anonymity in bureaucratic systems.
Thank you. So if we take that thought about authentic freedom and think about that in the context of one of the issues that's very live for an organization like the Institute of Business Ethics, that is to help organizations to create really safe spaces to encourage a genuine speak up culture. So things can be raised in a supportive, positive, constructive way at a much earlier stage than the kind of nuclear option of whistleblowing and so on, where almost you could say things have, if it gets to a whistleblowing stage, things have really potentially got very, very bad and negative. Rebecca, any thoughts about, as we move more organizations into the 5-generation workplace, how do managers help employees of different generations to feel that sense of psychological safety so that they can speak up at a relatively early stage?
Well, again, I love that you brought us back to managers, because I think it's one of our untold gifts right now that we have. And there was a brilliant article, it was a while ago last year, in the New York Times, all about this. Happy to send that link to it, but it was absolutely brilliant. And it was almost talking about the untold poetry of managers in organizations. But, again, don't get me started on poetry, because as Patrick knows, I will link that to business any day of the week. But actually, I will link it. And you sparked that thought, David, as you always do with your brilliance, which is a quote by John Berger. So we'll probably know the late great John Berger for his inimitable Ways of Seeing that came out over 50 years ago, which really challenged the whole notion of how we look at art and culture. But it was a brilliant quote. He was also a poet. And he talked about poetry as defying the space which separates. And I do think, to build on that point, that the power of poetry, it cannot necessarily resolve our challenges in and of themselves, but it defies the space which separates. And I do think there's something to be followed through around the ability of managers to defy those spaces that separate in organizations, to be the closers of those gaps, those absolute arch bridging roles and people. And again, that's going to need that empowerment in leaders to enable that and to foster that and nurture that. But I honestly think, David, that is where the magic is. And I'm excited by, I mean, Patrick and I have seen that in bucket loads through a lot of the organizations that we've spoken with. It shows up potentially in indexes stronger in leading family businesses, because there's a lot of more, again, going back to that point of intentionality in a hyper attentive world. The greater intent you have behind, again, follows through to Lucien's beautifully articulated point around the actualization of things, because right now there frankly isn't, a lot of this is not rocket science. Isabel Bewick at the FT was very kind in giving a review of the book, and she said a lot of this is, it is following through on other philosophical business thinking, which is about doing fewer things well and sustaining them. And it really punches home that, and to quote Margaret Heffernan, the world doesn't need ever more models and frameworks. What we need to do is do better with what we have always had in organizations, but laddering that up to, we're now in a 5-generational workforce. So for me, it's all about the managers, David.
And we've had Margaret on an IBE webinar a while back now, and I'm delighted to say that she's going to be doing another one for us in a few months' time. So
wonderful.
I'm sure that
that's
our CEO will pick up some of those points. But just conscious that we're almost out of time, and I do just want to get you all just to give any sort of key messages for busy managers. You quoted what I thought was a really powerful piece of research from the CMI a while back, this idea of 82% of people who become managers in the UK do so without any prior training or formal guidance, hence this idea of the accidental managers. How do we support managers, especially managers at relatively more junior levels, where a lot of some of the more raw discussions between generations is probably going to be experienced? How can we support those managers better to ensure a positive kind of speak up, constructive, ethical culture when they're dealing with a wider range of generations.
Patrick, shall I pass the baton or Lucian?
I'll
We're
cover
running tight on time now, so
a quick thought. So I think when people work together on something meaningful, they get to know each other better, they respect each other, they trust each other better, and so on. So I think we shouldn't be doing anything artificial. We should just intentionally, as a manager, I mean, I deliberately, when I was running things, building teams, would mix them up, and would be surprising people by picking someone maybe from left field more junior, maybe from left field more senior on something than they might do otherwise, just to get them together. When they start working together constructively on something, solving a problem together, that's when you get the real magic. The second thing I think that really people need to understand, what is the demographic of their workforce? I don't think people really understand. They don't have the numbers. It's a really simple thing, to get, what is that demographic and how is that going to change? And do the same for your market. And then you'll suddenly realize actually you really need to shift something to make that work. And then your decision making. So whenever you're taking a decision, consult, chat with someone from a different age group to yours, and there will be value to be added for sure. So little practical things I would pick.
Thank you. And Lucian?
Yes, I suppose relating to what Patrick was saying, but maybe adding to it would be experiment, be bold, in the sense of try new things, knowing that and recognizing that with this capacity of action, there is this inherent unpredictability. So that can mean for good, but also for bad. So there should be sort of this common promise that, of course, and this intentionality that you're trying to make decisions for contributing to the public good and the public sphere, but at the same time also be able to have this space of forgiveness when things go wrong. So there should be really a culture of action, experiments, initiatives, whether this leads to better outcomes or not always better outcomes, that's beyond our control in many ways. But that shouldn't stop us from taking those actions.
Thank you. And Rebecca?
I'm going to end with a quote, David. By the way, I loved your use of the word forgiveness, Lucian. I couldn't agree with you more. We honestly have to catch up for a coffee. I'll end with a quote that we open with, David, if we may. It's full of quotes. Sorry, forgive us. I truly am a quote nerd, but it's a beautiful one by the writer Anne Carson, and she said, "To stay human is to break a limitation." And I think it speaks to so much of the work that is true of the book. So much, exactly as you said, Lucian. That's where the forgiveness comes in, where the actualization comes in. I think Hannah Arendt would be absolutely smiling at that quote. So I think perhaps there's a reflection for us all today as individuals and as collectives, and that really is the spirit of the subtitle, which is the operative part of the book, which is how we win together for good.
Fantastic. That's a
Beautiful.
wonderful quote on which to end today's webinar. We will be having a recording of the webinar available on the Institute of Business Ethics website. Our next webinar is actually with Margaret Heffernan on June the 5th. So please do sign up for that, when our CEO, Lauren Branston, will be in conversation with Margaret. But for now, I'd like to thank enormously Rebecca and Patrick, the co-authors of 5 Generations at Work, How We Win Together for Good. Love that double entendre in that subtitle. And also Lucian von Schomburg from our Future Leaders Network. Thank you all very much. Thank you. I hope that you have enjoyed this webinar and you will want to come to more Institute of Business Ethics events in the future. Thank you very much.
Thanks, David.
Thanks so much, David.